Welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to the latest episode of Talk and Stalk, your unholy home for horror. I'm your host, as always, Barry, and today's podcast is going to be devoted to a slasher movie released in the late 80s, 89 to be exact, and that is Intruder. Now, this is a slasher film that really doesn't get talked about much. I really feel like slasher movies were really starting to fizzle out at this point. You know, with the big commercial success of Halloween, many slasher films followed in Halloween's footsteps. We had everything from, Terror Train, Prom Night, Friday the 13th, The Prowler, My Bloody Valentine. The list goes on and on. But going into the mid and late 80s, we had a lot of franchises going. We had Halloweens, we had Friday the 13th, we had The Nightmare on Elm Streets. And I really kind of feel towards the late 80s, slasher movies were slowly starting to fizzle out, and I actually think Intruder is actually one of the better slasher movies from the late 80s, but again, it doesn't really get talked about that much. Now, this film actually does star Bruce Campbell, Sam Raimi, and Ted Raimi. Now, when I say, you see Bruce Campbell's name on the opening credits, and for anyone that's an Evil Dead fan, you're going to be sitting there thinking, where the hell's Bruce Campbell? You've got two-thirds of the way through the film. Bruce Campbell only appears in kind of a blink and you'll miss it role at the very end of the movie. Sam Raimi and Ted Raimi, they're characters in the film, but basically, obviously riding on the success of Evil Dead, they basically were all heavily promoted by Paramount as the stars of the film. But of course, none of them are actually the stars, the lead characters in the movie at all. This film, what I actually really like about this film as well is the setting. The film was actually shot in an actual grocery store, so there's a level of authenticity to it. And it kind of makes me wonder, I watch this film and I kind of think to myself, why aren't there more slasher movies or just horror films in general set in grocery stores? What I like about it is, the whole film takes place on one night, grocery store, after hours, and obviously the characters are being bumped off one by one. Now, the movie heavily basically points its fingers to one person being responsible for these murders. There's the big prime suspect of the movie, and I quite like the opening to this film as well. We get the shot of a full moon and that kind of creepy kind of underlying score to it. And then we get this very kind of Halloween-esque shot. One of the characters is taking the trolleys out, and then the camera pans outwards and we see a figure stood there in the corner. It's very kind of Michael Myers-esque. And then as they go back into the store, they shut the door, and of course, through the reflection, we actually see the killer. What's presumed to be the killer. Of course, there is actually a bit of a reveal in this film, but for anyone that's actually observant, I think they'd actually work out who the killer is pretty damn quick in this film. Obviously, the big red herring, we're led to believe that this guy is actually the killer. We hear a story that he was actually involved in a murder, in the death of a man. Apparently, he had a drug habit as well. So, we're led to believe that this guy is the killer. Obviously, he's causing an altercation in the store. It's cool because we actually get to see Danny Hicks actually kick a bit of ass in this film. And Danny Hicks, may he rest in peace. Obviously, he was in Evil Dead 2 a couple of years prior to this. The film was directed by Scott Spiegel, who was a long-time collaborator with Sam Raimi. They actually did many short films together prior to the Evil Dead. And it was really Scott Spiegel's idea of basically injecting much of the humour into Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn. He was actually the one responsible for essentially turning the film into a horror comedy. It was kind of like his idea to kind of veer away from straight out horror, and So, Scott Spiegel, long-time collaborator. It only made perfect sense to obviously put his good friends into this film, Bruce Campbell, Ted Raimi, and Sam Raimi. And, there are some kind of Evil Dead-esque moments, as ridiculous as that might sound. There's some interesting little shots that's very kind of a Sam Raimi / Scott Spiegel esque thing. We get a shot, one of the very first shots in the film, in fact. We actually get kind of a POV shot through a trolley. So we're actually seeing a trolley being pushed. Then a little later, there's a shot through the bottom of a telephone. There's a shot through a glass. There's all these little kind of interesting little camera shots that you get kind of peppered throughout the film. And as I said with this film, we get the killer reveal. Now, in a few scenes in the film, a couple of scenes in particular, you can actually, if you're observant, you can actually see that the killer is actually wearing blue. And considering there's only one character in the film that's actually wearing blue, I think you can quickly work out who the killer is. But that doesn't detract from the film at all. I really think this film makes good use of its setting. The characters, it's great seeing Ted Raimi and Sam Raimi in there. Ted Raimi, funnily enough, basically has very few lines. I think there's just a couple of lines he actually says through the course of the film. He has his headphones on for 95% of his screen time, and he's listening to the same song over and over again. It's this real kind of very 80s, this kind of cheesy song, and it's clearly on a loop. It's on auto repeat and whatever. He must seriously be dreaming of that song when he actually goes to bed. He actually ends up with a large kitchen knife in the head. And it's quite funny, actually, because as soon as he's killed, we see this sign on the wall behind him saying, "Be careful, knives are very sharp." And there's an pretty awesome kill as well, involving a hydraulic. I'm not quite sure what it is. It's like a large hydraulic. I don't know. It's not a lift. It's some kind of compressor, and obviously one of the victims is actually crushed in it. It's a pretty cool kill. I think some of the kills in this film are actually pretty good. We get Sam Raimi, who's actually put up and stuck on a meat hook. It was very kind of reminiscent of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in fact, to me, that scene. But yeah, he's picked up with a display of superhuman strength, clearly, from the killer. As we all know, the killers in these movies very often have superhuman strength and prove to be pretty hard to kill. And yeah, Danny Hicks, spoiler alert, of course, is actually the killer in this movie. And I think Danny Hicks, I think he knocks it out of the park in the final act of this film. We realise just how crazy this guy is, but in such a humorous manner. We find out quite early on in the film that this store is being sold. That Bill, I believe his name is, Bill and Danny, they're both co-owners. Basically, they've come to the decision to sell the store. Much to Bill's resentment. Bill loves the store. It's basically his home away from home. He absolutely loves the store. He spent 10 years there. The store is essentially his life. And he's killing because he loves the goddamn store. I just love that shot when we actually reveal he's the killer. As I said, I don't think it's really hard to work out who the killer is in this film, but it's still great. This is just a fun slasher movie. He kind of strolls out and that, and there's just this moment where, we reveal, it's revealed just how crazy he is, and he actually comes out and he says, "Can't you just see, I'm just crazy about this store." And she says, "Why did you have to kill all of them? They weren't part of it, selling the store." And he says, "Well, I couldn't let anyone get them away. Don't you realise? I couldn't let them take this store away from me. Can't you see? I'm just crazy about this store." And there's actually a moment earlier on in the film as well where he's actually telling an account of when he was actually a volunteer fireman. And that there was actually a moment where a fellow fireman, a fellow colleague of his, had actually arrived on a scene that was horrific, and there was actually a decapitated body, and he's eating a hamburger, and he goes, everyone else is like really, shocked at the imagery of this, and he walks in, picks up a severed head, and just walks away, swinging the head in one hand and eating his hamburger with the other. And there's actually a great shot, there's actually a great line, I love it, and it's the end of the film, it's towards the end, when we obviously get the killer reveal. And Bill is actually walking along and he's eating a hamburger with one hand and swinging the decapitated head with the other. And he says it's along the lines of, here comes fucking Parker walking down 9 Mile, swinging a head by the hair and eating his sandwich in the other. That was, needless to say, a really weak impression. I'm not even going to attempt in doing an impression of Danny Hicks there. But I absolutely love him in the final act of this movie, and he actually does get stabbed. And it's like, where did you get the knife? And this is one of them rare slasher movies as well, where the killer isn't actually dead, and it looks like the killer may actually get away with it. He's actually still alive, surprise, surprise. But basically he tells the police officers, one of which is Bruce Campbell, as I say, he appears on screen for about 5 seconds or so near the end of the movie. He basically tells them that they're responsible, and she lets out this big scream, and yeah. So essentially he might actually get away with these crimes, but just kind of like the motive. I mean, there's one character in this film as well that I'm going to assume is a stoner. He really does make me laugh. And there's a character that he interacts with quite a bit throughout the film, and I believe the other character's name is Tim, and this guy's always like, oh, Tim this, Tim that, and I just wish I got a pound every time he says Tim. It really is quite funny. He's clearly like a pothead, a stoner, and, interestingly as well in this film, if you look at the poster and some of the box cover art, they actually reveal that the killer is Bill. It actually reveals on the cover, which I think is really bad marketing, but it was quite often the case back in the day. Quite often there would be very revealing shots from the movie, sometimes the killer identity. And depending on the version you've got of this movie, I've actually seen this film on Blu-ray. I don't own it on Blu-ray, but I've seen the Blu-ray cover, and it actually clearly reveals that Bill Roberts is in fact the killer in this film. Now, the body count in this movie is actually pretty high. I mean, I think the film's like 83 minutes long. Admittedly, the murders don't actually start up until quite late on in the film, but when they start, they really get going. They do come quite thick and fast once the murders do start. And director Scott Spiegel, as well, interestingly, does actually make a cameo. He's actually the ill-fated bread man that shows up, and he's literally on screen for like a few seconds and actually gets killed. And from what I understand as well, like if you've got this film on DVD, which I actually own the DVD copy for years, on the back of the cover, it actually makes it appear that Renee Estevez is kind of the heroine. There seems to be a focus on her character on the back, whereas in the film, she's actually the first character to die. She actually gets this big-ass kitchen knife in her. And I believe there's only 2 characters in the movie, in fact, that are actually killed, aside from the killer. Obviously, he's not killed, but there's 2 characters that are actually killed outside of the store. And she's actually one of them. And if you do look closely, I mean, if you can, like, freeze frame, whatever, you can actually tell. You can tell that's Danny Hicks. But I actually think this is a good slasher film. Like I said, I think it kind of stands out because of the setting. It has one of the most absurdly ridiculous kind of motives for a killer to want to kill. But do you know what? That's part of the charm. That's the beauty of some of these films, is that, quite often in these slasher movies, revenge plays a big motive for a lot of killers in these slasher films. In this case, well, in a way it's revenge for, this guy actually wanting to sell the store and that, but he'd do anything. He just loves his job, loves his store, And as I said, I think the film actually makes pretty good use of its setting, and I do believe actually as well that at one point in pre-production, Tobe Hooper was originally set to direct. Tobe Hooper, Texas Chainsaw, Poltergeist, The Funhouse, Salem's Lot, a pretty big name in the genre that was actually going to direct this. But of course, it went to Scott Spiegel, who I actually think did a great job. Obviously it's a low budget slasher film. This isn't a film. It basically does what you expect it to do. This isn't a film that's out there to try and, reinvent the cinematic horror wheel, if you will. But also quickly getting back to what is probably my favourite line in the entire movie. The head in one hand, the sandwich in the other bit. Apparently, I read that, I didn't know this until quite recently, in fact, that apparently that speech was previously used in Raising Arizona, which of course was a Coen Brothers film. Now, again, the Coen Brothers are actually associated with Sam Raimi. The Coen Brothers and Sam Raimi were actually living together for a while, and they do actually have kind of a close-knit relationship. Now, admittedly, Raising Arizona is a really good film, but it's been years since I've seen it, so I don't actually recall that line. But of course it stars, future Oscar winner Holly Hunter, as well as my guilty pleasure, Nicolas Cage. So yeah, I think The Intruder, I think the pacing's generally quite good. I think there's a build-up. There's certainly a build-up. This guy refuses to leave. There's a bit of a punch-up. They kick him out. And then obviously, you're led to believe that he's going to get in, he's going to start killing them. For example, he leaves a note. There's a note that's actually left on one of the shelves that says, "I still love you." This is to the woman that he's trying to get back. Obviously, he can't take no for an answer. He tells her that he still loves her and he's going to do anything to get her back, which would imply to us as the audience that probably involves murder. But of course, it all turns out to be a big red herring. There's another little moment, just a small little moment in the film that kind of makes me laugh. It's one of the earliest scenes in the movie, in fact. And that is where the two women are talking. I believe they're talking about her boyfriend or some guy that she's starting to see. And there's an old man who's just, trying to get served, and he feels like he's caught in the middle between this conversation, and he ends up dropping his products and that. So yeah, it's I think The Intruder overall it's a good slasher film. I think among the die-hard slasher fans out there, it is generally well received. I know it does have a fan base, but generally among the mainstream, this isn't really a film that I feel really gets talked about enough. Sure, it's no Halloween, it's no Black Christmas or anything like that. But in comparison to many of the other slasher films that were coming out during the time, it's certainly one of the better ones, in my opinion. Now, there was a slasher movie that was released in 1987, an Italian movie, actually, that some people classify as a giallo. I don't. I mean, there are certainly some giallo elements to it, but that's a film called Stage Fright. Top slasher film. Really like it. As I say, it was a couple of years before this. That is a film that I would really recommend, actually, to anyone that is a slasher movie fan. Again, good setting, a very unique looking killer. The killer actually wears an owl mask in that movie and is actually an ex-theatre actor as well, who ended up institutionalised, and he escapes, the usual kind of old horror trope. So yeah, that's a movie that I would recommend. And again, I think that's kind of one of the better later 80s slasher movies. So yeah, Intruder, good setting, certainly worth a watch for slasher fans. There is one thing I will say. Now, I watched this on the streaming service, Shudder, and there was actually one kill that seemed to be cut. Now, I'm pretty certain I saw this kill on DVD before, and I believe it's been cut. There's actually a death. You don't actually see the death, that's the thing. I believe it's like an electric cutter. I think it's like a meat cutter or something. And one of the victims is dragged to it, and basically they're put down on it, and obviously they're going to get cut. But we don't actually see it, which is a real shame. Not to sound like, I'm sadistic or anything like that, but you had this kind of big setup for this big kill, and then it completely cuts away. Whereas with the kind of pneumatic compressor, the hydraulic compressor that we see, we actually get to see that kill pretty much in all its glory, almost. Whereas this one, it completely cuts away to a different scene, which seems really strange to me. But I don't know, maybe I'm remembering things wrong. Maybe on DVD it was cut as well. But it just seemed a really strange decision to make, considering I don't feel like the film shied away from the gore in any other scenes or aspects. So, but yeah, that's pretty much all I really want to talk about today concerning Intruder. It is a slasher movie that I enjoy. It is a slasher film that I probably should own, in all honesty. I do need to get it on Blu-ray at some point. As I said, it's just great seeing... Because you don't often see Sam Raimi in front of the camera. You don't. Ted Raimi, yes. Now, I know that Sam Raimi actually said many years ago that he always found Bruce Campbell was the good-looking one. So whenever they do films and stuff, he wants Bruce Campbell to be the guy in front of the camera because women love him, whereas Sam Raimi's not exactly the looker that Bruce Campbell is. Ted Raimi, obviously, has been in front of the camera many times, but... yeah, if you want to see Ted Raimi, getting a knife in his head and wearing headphones and listening to, the same song throughout the entire film, this is the film to watch, certainly. So, yeah, that's all I really want to say concerning The Intruder. So thanks a lot to everyone that listened, and I'll be back again soon to haunt you and torment you. Take care, and if you've liked what you've heard, please feel free to subscribe.